Prepare to embark on a post-apocalyptic world dominated by terrifying creatures, where a family struggles to survive in an underground shelter. On a dark night, little Zoe was still awake, seeking refuge under her bed and softly calling for her mother. Claire quickly approached to comfort her daughter in this moment of fear. With a gentle and loving voice, Claire calmed Zoe, reminding her of the fourth vital rule of their stay in the shelter: never raise your voice when talking about the monsters that roam the surface. Confident that they were safe under the watchful eye of Ray, the one responsible for guarding the shelter's entrance, Claire suggested they check on how he was doing. Walking cautiously, Zoe was startled by every shadow or unknown object, including a paper figure made during New Year's festivities with her father. It was only in Ray's comforting arms that she found some peace. Adversity had forced Zoe to mature quickly, both in thoughts and actions. Curious and eager for safety, she asked Ray for a detailed account of his nightly vigil. Ray, with a gentle smile, turned his observations into a playful game to remind his daughter that despite the circumstances, she was still a child. Despite Ray's reassuring words, Zoe felt the need to personally check the door locks to ensure no monster could invade their refuge. Claire was hesitant, considering Zoe too young for such a responsibility, but Ray defended the idea, believing that the girl's survival depended on her ability to take on responsibilities. To reaffirm her competence and earn her mother's trust, Zoe accurately recited the shelter's 4 survival rules. After a meticulous inspection, with all locks and chains checked, the family could return to their normal routine inside. Tenderly, Ray fixed a worn-out pair of Zoe's shoes, emphasizing the humanity they still possessed, a counterpoint to the almost savage life outside. In a rare moment of lightness, Claire lit a kerosene lamp, and its dancing flames reflected off the canned goods around them, illuminating the darkness and creating the illusion of a small, personal sun, marking another day of resistance and hope. More than 300 days had passed since the apocalyptic devastation swept the world, a period during which creatures known as breathers annihilated almost all existing life. In the monotony of that shelter, even making marks on the wall became an educational opportunity for Zoe, with Claire using it to teach her mathematics, preparing her for an uncertain future where normalcy might be a possibility. On a typical day of confinement, during lunch, Zoe, acting like any child her age, showed her aversion to beans and expressed a strong desire for canned peaches. Claire, always pragmatic and conscientious, insisted on the need to ration food, arguing that they could not indulge in the tastier items every day. Ray, on the other hand, with his characteristic kindness, supported his daughter's whim and proposed a quick vote. Claire was in the minority in the decision. While Ray dealt with a rusty mechanism to collect water, Zoe, excited, opened the can of peaches, only to find it empty. Claire, initially incredulous, soon noticed a small hole in the side of the can. A more thorough inspection revealed that 11 other cans had been tampered with, probably by a rat that had invaded the shelter through the ventilation system. Zoe, frightened, asked if the breathers could use the same path, but her parents quickly reassured her, explaining that these creatures were too large to pass through the narrow opening. Discouragement took hold of Zoe, who lamented the lack of friends, the impossibility of exploring the outside world, and the absence of peaches because of the rat. Ray's frustration emerged at these words, reminding her that she had loving parents and should feel grateful for that. He emphasized the miracle of having survived for so long, a month since the last incident, and urged Zoe to appreciate what they had, including the nasty beans that guaranteed them another day of life. After lunch, father and daughter tried to forget their adversities with a board game about magical journeys. Zoe rolled the dice and found herself transported to a place she had visited shortly before the cataclysm. Ray covered his daughter's eyes, allowing her to mentally travel to that place and recall its forgotten beauty. Later, while Zoe was distracted playing cards with her doll Olive, Claire and Ray discussed their critical resource situation. Despite Claire's concerns about dwindling supplies, Ray remained resilient and determined, even considering risking a surface expedition to search for provisions despite the dangers. To distract themselves from the daily tensions, the couple decided to indulge in moments of intimacy, attempting to forget the memories of life before they took refuge in the shelter. After lunch, Claire resumed educational activities with Zoe, encouraging her to practice counting and writing, keeping the flame of learning alive even in adverse conditions. Curious and restless, Zoe asked if there were other survivors besides them. On this day, for the first time, Claire allowed her to use the improvised periscope they had built with mirrors, old cans, and tubes. Zoe peeked at the outside world through the ventilation duct, observing the desolation around the school shelter, seeing nothing suspicious or the entrance to the shelter, skillfully hidden from the breathers. Claire seized the moment to teach a valuable lesson. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This perspective renewed Zoe's hopes that other survivors might be out there, waiting for the moment to reunite and rebuild civilization. Soon after this exploration, Zoe spotted the rat again trying to access the food shelf. Waking Ray, she trusted him to solve the issue. Armed with a knife, Ray tried to hit the intruder but missed, and the knife ended up lodged in the wood without hitting the target. Claire, on the other hand, resolved the situation definitively, eliminating the rat with a wrench in a decisive blow. Meanwhile, a greater incident unfolded when the rat, in its attempt to escape, knocked over the kerosene lamp. A fast-spreading flame spread across the table, intensifying the danger by the second. Claire tried to smother the fire with the curtains, but to no avail. Acting quickly, Ray managed to put out the fire with water, avoiding a major disaster. In the midst of the chaos, Zoe disappeared. After a frantic search, her parents found her under the bed, crying, fearing that the smoke escaping through the ventilation duct would alert the breathers to their presence, drawing them to the shelter. At this critical moment, the family recalled a peaceful day shortly before the cataclysm. They were savoring bacon on a typical weekend morning, planning a trip to the local beach in Kingsville. It was then that they learned, through a well-known politician, of the rapid spread of a terrible virus in North Carolina, triggering a mass exodus from the region, including their neighbors and the boy Zoe had a crush on. In an attempt to assess the risk of the small fire, Ray used the periscope to spy on the surroundings for any breathers that might be lurking. Claire, overcome with panic, feared that the smoke might be visible from the outside, but Ray calmed her, confident that the smoke would dissipate in time and that the shelter's well-camouflaged entrance would remain undetectable. Although this brings a glimmer of optimism, Claire watches with concern as the charred wood leaves behind ash and soot residue. After checking with the periscope, Ray agrees that the residue could inadvertently reveal their location. Feeling they have no other option, they decide to risk a quick trip to the surface to eliminate any evidence of the shelter. Aware of the dangers, Ray and Claire instruct Zoe to stay in the bunker and under no circumstances to leave. Limiting their exposure to just 3 minutes, they head to the surface, fully aware of the risks involved. Curious, Zoe watches her parents through the periscope, and in a moment of tension, believes she sees a figure in the nearby forest. Attempting to alert them unsuccessfully, she decides to disobey instructions and leaves the shelter to call them. Her scream, laden with fear, echoes dangerously in the air. To her relief, the supposed monsters are just passing deer. Claire notices the animal's fright, signaling that an even greater danger is approaching. With that, they run back to the shelter, locking the hatch with all the chains and padlocks available. Minutes later, they hear the threatening sound of a breather nearby. The possibility that it was attracted by the smoke or saw them during the post-fire cleanup is alarming, but what is more concerning is that it seems to be directly above them with no intentions of leaving. Zoe, overwhelmed with panic, begins to cry uncontrollably. Claire tries to calm her, reminding her of the first rule of the shelter, but fear and anxiety dominate the girl. Claire is terrified that the breather will hear Zoe's cries and discover their location, but her attempts at consolation seem to fail. Ray then intervenes, trying to support Zoe and distract her with her favorite game. He covers her eyes and suggests she imagine being in a safe place, a mental refuge where nothing can reach them. This calms her momentarily, but the threatening presence of the monster lurking around the shelter becomes increasingly evident as it seems to sniff something, moving dangerously close to the hatch that barely hides their presence. The family's terror intensifies even more when they notice that Zoe, in her panic, didn't see a protruding pipe, and the string of her talking doll got caught on one of the exposed screws. The immediate concern is if the doll starts talking, it could attract the monsters directly to them. Unfortunately, their fear becomes reality when the doll suddenly activates, speaking loudly. While Claire hugs Zoe, trying to silence her by covering her mouth, Ray takes drastic measures and destroys the doll to turn off the sound device, trying to prevent the situation from worsening. Zoe, although understandably saddened by the loss of her doll, soon realizes that more serious concerns surround them. At the peak of tension, the breather discovers the entrance to the shelter. They hear the terrible sound of someone trying to force the hatch, which holds thanks to the chains, but the monster displays supernatural strength, pulling the chains and dislodging part of the concrete that sustains them. With fewer chains firmly holding the entrance, the family rushes to reinforce the barrier. In these moments of terror, Claire does her utmost to prevent the monster from invading the shelter, even as she is struck by the chain. Simultaneously, Ray acts quickly, dismantling the water collection system to remove a piece of metal pipe, which he uses to reinforce the hatch blockade. When the monster becomes visible, terrifying Zoe even more, who lets out a sharp scream, Ray strikes it with the pipe before finally sealing the entrance. Blocking the only access route to the shelter, they feel a momentary relief. Shortly after, the tension rises again when the walls start to tremble, indicating the arrival of more breathers. While the ground shook beneath their feet, Ray remembered the moments before total chaos. They had tried to leave the city, noticing that neighbors who had left earlier were inexplicably returning. When they attempted to escape, they found the exits blocked, and the army ordering everyone to return to their homes due to a quarantine. At that moment, the ground was already trembling, a harbinger of the horror to come. Now, with the monsters trying to break through the last barrier, the family fights desperately for a few more minutes of safety. Claire, in a last effort, breaks a kerosene lamp and uses the fire to ignite the curtains, trying to block the corridor while they reinforce their defenses with a metal shelf. Faced with the reality that there is no way out and no real chance of survival, Zoe suggests that they could try to escape through the ventilation duct. Ray, realizing that this might be their only chance, begins to break the boards covering the access to the duct, helping Claire prepare the path that might be their last route to the surface. After ensuring the path was clear, Claire pulled Zoe out of the shelter. Ray, the last to try to escape, faced a challenge. His broad shoulders barely fit through the narrow ventilation duct. With the monsters quickly approaching the flaming shelf, Ray, in a desperate act, forced his shoulder, injuring it to fit through the space. He shouted for Claire to help him out. Despite all of Claire's efforts, the monsters managed to grab Ray, dragging him back into the burning hell of the shelter. Claire and Zoe, devastated by the sudden loss, had to run to save their own lives. The two, running desperately, reached the outskirts of the city where it all began. There, a helicopter flew overhead and dropped a net with metal balls, unexpectedly trapping them. Quickly surrounded by the breathers, they realized that they were actually soldiers in protective suits, tasked with identifying and eliminating the infected. Before any drastic action, the commander ordered a blood test to check if Claire and Zoe were infected. A flashback then revealed that the tremors felt earlier were not caused by an earthquake, but by military jets bombing the city. The government's decision had been radical. Exterminating thousands of people was seen as a more effective solution than allowing the virus to spread across the country. Panic ensued as the population watched homes, schools, and other buildings being reduced to rubble. Those near the city exits saw the jets approaching and realized they had little time to seek refuge and try to survive. It was then that Claire remembered the elementary school that housed an old air raid bunker. The family ran there, reaching the hatch moments before the bombs exploded. Initially, the shelter seemed like a safe refuge, equipped with books, toys, and provisions. But the hope of a normal life crumbled when Claire, after cutting herself, noticed her blood was black. She realized that the infection was spreading through the air and that they were all, in fact, infected. In the present moment, as the soldiers prepared to execute mother and daughter, presuming them infected, Ray, miraculously surviving, appeared attacking them. The infection had transformed them into creatures that retained human appearance until rage consumed them. In that state, they became incredibly strong and violent, capable of annihilating everything around them. The soldiers, cornered in the shelter, could not execute Ray, who, taken by the uncontrollable fury provoked by the infection, eliminated them one by one. Protecting his family at all costs, Ray faced the soldiers with fierce determination, sacrificing himself in a final act of bravery. Despite his fierce resistance, he was repeatedly shot. Witnessing Ray's fall, Claire was overcome by a devastating rage. She broke free from the net that trapped them and found refuge for Zoe in a nearby abandoned car. As the soldiers continued to hunt them, Claire, driven by superhuman strength, confronted and eliminated each one with lethal precision. In the climax of this bloody battle, the last soldier managed to wound Claire, but while he was reloading his weapon for the final blow, Zoe, transformed by the same monstrous force consuming her mother, intervened fiercely. Zoe's fight was relentless, but upon seeing the soldier lose his mask and become infected, she found within herself the capacity to spare his life. With the threat neutralized, mother and daughter, now calmed and returning to their human forms, bid farewell to Ray, who succumbed to his injuries. As the helicopter continued to hover over the area searching for them, Claire and Zoe sought refuge in the city sewers, hoping to avoid further detection. At the break of the next day, the sound of footsteps echoing in the underground corridor awakened Claire and Zoe, bringing fears that the breathers were in pursuit. However, to their surprise and relief, it was Joey, a neighbor who had found Zoe's jacket and was looking for her. He led them to an underground hideout where many of Kingsville's infected residents had found refuge. In this new subterranean sanctuary, Claire and Zoe realized that despite the adversities, life found a way to continue. They joined this community of survivors, preparing to live in the shadows, continuing to evade the United States Army and the threats that still might exist on the surface. Thus, with hope and resilience, they adapted to this new reality, uniting with others in the fight for survival in the underground depths.